Good morning, guys. Today, Wednesday, we're a week and a half away from the test, so don't blink. It's going to go by quick. Today, I wanted to cover period 4 extensively, but I do want to touch on the end of period 3 and how it kind of transitions into period 4, and then start the transition 2 into period 5. So today, we'll begin with where we left off, anti-federalist and federalist. And what we see is that there's a faction in American society on what this new government, the Constitution, should look like. The power that a federal government will hold over the states and the people. And that's the crux of that argument. I mean, the idea that America was different is that it didn't have that. But at the same time, they realized the weaknesses also in the Articles of Confederation, their first form of government that fails. It couldn't raise an army to protect us from rebellions from within. And it's Shays' Rebellion that shows that. And it's the Whiskey Rebellion that proves that the Constitution is strong enough now to raise an army to put down these rebellions when they do spring up. So what does that bring? Well, that brings government stability. And ultimately, in the end, that's the survival of any government. And when we start to see Washington in his 2 terms of office, remember, he sets a lot of precedents. One of those 2 terms until FDR, obviously, in his unprecedented 4 terms. But with the amendment to the Constitution now, that no longer can happen. But many presidents, again, all of them, but FDR would serve 2 terms just because Washington did this. And the gift that Washington gave to our country, the government, not only obviously serving as lead general, commander of all the forces of the revolutionary forces, but also in what he gave to the presidency. As a servant to the American citizenry. He truly believed in that. But Washington himself looked at the factions that were forming in American society as a true danger. These 2 political parties were forming right underneath his nose, and he knew it. And what he had to do is figure out a way to try to convince the American people that this was the wrong course that America was taking. He did this in his farewell address. He basically had 3 main points that he wanted to make to the American people. The first being that we shouldn't entangle ourselves in foreign affairs, especially European affairs, because he felt it would drag America into war, and America simply wasn't ready. It was a younger country that needed time to develop. On the world stage, it had to grow first before it could do anything, make any kind of impact there. And then the second one was the factioning of parties. And he felt that a 2-party system in America would really be kind of the death knell to American society, that politicians would start choosing party over country, that they would serve their party first instead of what's best for the country. They would do what's best for their party. And I would have to say that really he was wrong for the better part of our history. Now, I can say that with hindsight, and it's always easy there. But there's only really 2 times in our history where it wasn't working, this 2-party system, and that was during the Civil War and our current political situation. I mean, just look at American society in general. It's not just politicians or politics. It's American society. And it really does hamper American society when 2 sides cannot find a way to compromise. And that's truly where America has always been, great in the sense of, there's 2 different arguments. And in societies, there's always going to be that case. It's conservatism versus liberalism. The idea of keeping things the same or wanting change. And there's always going to be, 2 camps. But as long as those 2 camps can air out what they want and then obviously come together for some type of agreement, then that's usually serves what's best or the greater good of a country. And that's what you want. But the other thing that he touched on too was religion, and the idea that religion could give moral standing and the strong moral fiber to its American citizenry. And those are the 3 main points that he made. Now, when he leaves office, it is going to be John Adams that takes over. And the other question comes up, And this is who are we going to kind of ally ourselves with in the world, at least as far as trade and support within Europe. And we start touching on this. Obviously, the Neutrality Act in 1793 under Washington declares that we're not getting involved in the French affairs or the British affairs or European affairs whatsoever. However, we still start to support different countries, and the Federalists want to support the British. Why? We need British money. We need the banks to loan us money to develop. So the Federalists are supporters of the British. The anti-Federalists become supporters of the French. And ultimately, you're going to see these two parties moving in that direction in their support of these two European countries. But in 1800, there's a self-proclaimed revolution, and it's one that is led by Thomas Jefferson, proclaimed by Thomas Jefferson when he's elected, that this country is now going to truly feel what the revolution was all about, the power to the people in the states. Here, this is Thomas Jefferson, kind of sticking it to John Adams in a way, and the Federalists too. And saying that this is this new true birth of freedom. This revolution is going to bring change to the people, and this agrarian society of farmers, this agrarian economy is going to make people understand how equality really works, and what freedom brings, where states can make decisions for what's best for their people. But ultimately, in the end, what we see under Jefferson is that he actually goes against all of these things. He starts to transition into actually increasing federal power, increasing the presidential power, the executive power. He actually declares war on the Barbary states. Sorry, that's the kids. He declares war on the Barbary states. He actually makes the purchase, the Louisiana Territory. Think about this. I mean, this is a guy who preached about, the downsizing of federal government and power, but yet increased it all the while. So yes, he preached these things, but ultimately in the end, when he becomes president and it's on his watch, so to speak, he understands that the strength of government is stability, and he has to improve the power of that, and he increases the size of America too. Now, this helps the anti-federalist. That land that we purchase is all farmland, and that's going to increase the agrarian capabilities of American society, but it's also going to increase the number of Democratic Republican voters who are going to vote Democratic Republican because that's what they support, the farmers. The Federalists themselves are eventually going to die out, and this is for a couple of reasons. Obviously, Hamilton and his duel with Burr is not going to help. It's kind of the start of the beginning of the end to the Federalist Party. He's shot and killed in this duel, and he was the leader, the face of the Federalist Party. Thomas Jefferson, obviously, being the face of the anti-Federalist. But as the Federalists move forward, what's really going to crush them is the War of 1812. And this is where the politics start to turn. So the Federalists don't support the War of 1812, even though it's the anti-Federalists that were screaming, which is so ironic. That the reason why we got to go to war with Britain is because their impressment policies on American ships. And so this starts this I guess, infighting and this one. Well, the Federalists deny this and say, wait a minute, we're perfectly okay. The Atlantic Ocean is plenty big enough. We'll avoid those ships and we'll take our chances. They don't want war with the British. It's going to slow down trade. It's going to hurt the merchants that are trying to trade, not only British goods, but world goods. And they know that Britain's the center of all this. And a war with them is going to lead to an embargo where they're not going to trade with us. And so that's going to hurt their pockets. And in the end, they don't want this war. But the anti-Federalists want it because they know that the land in the area developed past Appalachia is something that they can begin to do. And it's the Native Americans and the British that are, in a sense, standing in their way in this development. And so ultimately, in the end, they want this war to solidify the American power, to expand, America's democracy west of Appalachia, going all the way to the Mississippi. And this is the whispering of manifest destiny. America is looking to expand. In the end, the War of 1812 is somewhat of a success. I mean, the Battle of New Orleans, even though it happens after the war was officially over. Remember, news traveled very slow with the Pony Express. It was a major victory, the springboard for Andrew Jackson's presidency. And what we do see, too, is that the British starting to understand that America is becoming this power. Again, this is, in a sense, for the Americans, a second victory against the British. And now America is ready to do what it feels that it's destined to do. Remember, the idea behind manifest destiny is God wanted America to become this great and powerful nation, and expansion would help in doing so, westward expansion. And so America begins to. And as they begin to expand, they begin to develop all kinds of different ways to trade. And I'm going to get to that in just a second. The last thing I really want to end with, with the politics, is how it shaped out in this final stage of this period. The Federalist Party dies because the War of 1812 was a success. They didn't want it, and now they have egg on their face basically from it. And so that dies off, which starts the era of good feelings, because there's only one party now in American society. And because of that, it's known as the era of good feelings. Now, this is going to be short-lived. By the election of 1824, we're going to see a faction between the two different groups again. And it's going to come out of really the Anti-Federalist Party. You're going to have the John Quincy Adams camp, and you're going to have the Andrew Jackson camp. And this is where you're also going to see two more parties emerge after that. The election of 1828 is going to bring on Andrew Jackson, and he's going to be able to, use the failed election of 1824 and the conspiracy behind it, the corrupt bargain, and obviously the tariff of abominations that's going to be signed under John Quincy Adams. He's going to use that to win the presidency of 1828. And this starts the Southern Democrats. And remember, the Democrats, for the longest time, were in the South. We won't see that transition again where the Democratic Party starts moving to the North until Truman in 1948, when he starts desegregating the military and starts something known as the Dixiecrats of the late 40s and early 50s, where they start to faction off because Dixie, South, they don't like, again, desegregationist policies. They want to keep segregation in society and Jim Crow. So that starts the factioning of the Democratic Party. But the other parties and other party that's going to emerge, out of the Federalist side of things is going to be one that's really in opposition to Andrew Jackson. There's third parties that arise just because of him. You have the Anti-Mason Society that is formed for the sole purpose and the hatred of him. But again, this is America, and these third parties do spring up. It does offer something temporarily, but usually they're too narrowly focused, and so they usually lose their luster pretty quick. And we talked about this in class, how they're usually consumed by their own side of the party. And that's just American politics. It's how it works. These two parties are going to try to survive anyway. And third parties usually break up or faction their own party. So they usually end up consuming or eating their own. And we've seen this several different times in our history. But that's where things are going in American society. However, the party that's going to give Andrew Jackson the most opposition is going to be the Whig Party. And they emerge, we'll even have Whig presidents. And they emerge in direct opposition to the Southern Democrats. And so we have a two-party system once again, once we see this. So America is starting to expand. And westward expansion leads to growth of states. And the war with Mexico, beyond the Louisiana Purchase, is that next thing. I mean, Louisiana Purchase is going to bring us to the Mississippi. and in the war and slightly beyond. And then the war with Mexico is going to really push us to the west, all the way to the west. And so we see basically America, War of 1812 developing, pushing further westward past Appalachia into the Midwest. The Louisiana Purchase territory coming in there, and then west of the Mississippi River, that further development. But America is still looking to expand, and it still wants to open up more markets, and it's kind of getting impatient with how it's looking in foreign trade. And one way to beef up their trade is to develop this land more. And so this war with Mexico, 1846 to 1848, is one that's extremely beneficial. Territories of New Mexico, Nevada, California, these territories are going to become a part of America. But also the reason why it all started is because we annexed Texas, which is obviously a very large country very large state along with California, that is going to increase the size of this country by a third. And really, this is going to lead us to the ultimate test in the finish of Manifest Destiny. Now, this is kind of like biting out of the forbidden fruit, because by expanding, yes, we increase markets, and we increased trade, and we increased industry in America that's starting. What you start to see is textile milling in America that's starting to compete on the world stage. We're making now our own clothing with our own cotton instead of shipping it to Britain to be made there. But you also see things like transportation increasing. So you had canals that are going to be the earliest forms of transportation and trans-state trade that's going to happen, or interstate trade. But eventually you're going to have the Transcontinental Railroad that's going to, obviously reach from east to west across the continent. And this is going to not only increase trade, but ultimately in the end, development of the West. Now people have a reason to exist out there. They can sell their goods. They can trade their goods to the East. The East are filling up the eastern cities. Chicago was born off of this because of the meat industry. And you obviously are going to have these plants where they're going to break down the cattle and break down the hog and dress this meat and dress this beef to be shipped off to the East Coast. But you start to see all these new technologies in trade, and then trinkets, Ed Sears and the pocket watch, and then Sears catalog where you can order anything. America, is going to develop greatly because of this expansion westward. But it also increases something else: tensions. Remember, this is a forbidden fruit in a way, because the South and the North disagree on slavery. And during this period, abolition begins to grow and grow. This period also marks the changing of many different things. You have the Second Great Awakening that is going to occur. You have different opinions and thoughts coming in that pushes all this. You had transcendentalist writing. You had the idea of, reform. The earliest forms. I mean, this is a movement, a grassroots movement that we start to see in the antebellum era, the pre-war era of the Civil War. Anything from Dorothea Dix and mental health facilities and prison reform, and you name it. That list goes on and on of people who wanted to try to change America for the better. Even Graham and his graham cracker, right? These are the types of things that start to unfold in American history, but none bigger than the abolitionist movement. And Uncle Tom's Cabin is going to be the centerpiece of this. It is going to be a read where it really shows the evils, in a sense, of slavery in Southern society, where before it was thought to be this institution that, benefited both the slave and the master in the Southern society, where now people are starting to look at this completely differently. And yeah, they probably thought it was bad before, but they didn't know how bad. And now all of a sudden, the North really sees the growth of abolition. And this pushes us closer and closer to war. But as we expand, the question comes up: are these going to be slave states or free states? And all at the same time, remember, you have the growing tensions between these two sides. In the end, this is going to push us to the Civil War. We find balance. we are going to find that, Henry Clay does a lot of influencing during this time. First, the American system, this idea of growth and expansion and new industries and new way to trade with one another through, again, interstate trade through canals and eventually, again, railroads, and then American institutions and education and all of those things that are being built. Those are all amazing. But Henry Clay also influences us in a much greater way too. He influences us in these compromises. And these compromises come really, multifold, but the two biggest ones, the Compromise of 1820, and this is when we start to add territories that are just west of the Mississippi, and the idea of what they're going to be. This is, how are we going to react to this? And this is where we start to understand how, how this is going to be added. These states are going to be added in. But we also see the Compromise of 1850. And this is Kansas going to be a free state, and John Brown and his armies coming in there. This is the course of action. It's also going to bring in the Fugitive Slave Law Act, where the North promises to return runaway slaves as contraband to their owners, their masters, and this all is going to increase these tensions. Remember, abolition is spreading for good reason. People are realizing the evilness of slavery in this institution. It is not some type of benign institution. It is extremely harmful to those people who are in bondage. And this is where the situation begins to really turn on its ear. And there's no going back. Even the Compromise of 1820, it is where Thomas Jefferson says this is the death knell to American society. He knows that by dividing a line, the Mason-Dixon line between slave states and free states, is going to lead us basically into this kind of spiraling downward into the Civil War, that now this is only going to increase tensions ultimately in the end. It's not fixing anything. It was a Band-Aid over a gaping wound. And that is going to, lead us into this war ultimately in the end. So period 4 is the prelude to the Civil War. It's the setup. And the antebellum era is that pre-war era. It's what it stands for, antebellum, pre-war, Civil War. So the Civil War is really period 5, Civil War, Reconstruction, the failure of, and that's what we'll get to tomorrow. But you start to see the shaping of all of this. America is on this path that it can't get off of. It's like standing on the train tracks and the train's coming at you and you can't get off. America is right there, and the Civil War is going to change it. Probably the greatest changing event in our history, and it even impacts us today. But we'll get to that tomorrow. You guys have a great day, and we'll see you tomorrow.